Cool.
I think it's episode 5 now. Welcome everybody that's listening. Thank you for everyone else that's listened so far. I'd like to introduce Dr. Madcap. Um, those of you that don't know, Dr. Cap is strength-based inclusion. So
Yeah.
your area of expertise. Do you want to give us an introduction to what that is? And
As said, my name's Matt Cap. I'm the director of an organization called Capitalized Education, and we really focus on building the capacity of teachers, schools, and educational systems around universal design and practical inclusion. If you're familiar with the response to intervention model, we're talking about that tier one support.
yeah,
Or if you're familiar with the nationally consistent collection of data, what is referred to as quality differentiated teaching practice.
QDDP, QTDP.
Yeah, so that support that is good for all diverse learners, that captures everyone or nearly everyone's needs. And so yeah, so that's what we focus on, is building the capacity of schools to do that.
So the universal design for learning framework. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about universal design?
Yeah, we focus on the universal design for learning framework as
Yeah.
I describe it to teachers as a problem-solving tool rather
Yeah.
than a set of strategies. It's really a tool to, when you know your kids' strengths and you know their kids' barriers to learning or functional impacts, but we always start with strengths, because if you start with barriers to learning or functional impacts, as the NCCD calls it, you end up down this rabbit hole of negativity. And so by
Yeah.
starting with the strengths, they're things that you can leverage to access that learning process and access the curriculum. And then once you've identified those strengths and those barriers to learning, the UDL framework provides you a tool for thinking about ways that you leverage those strengths and support those barriers. But then the great thing I like about universal design, it's not a set of strategies. So then teachers can choose the strategies they want to use within that framework, as long as it helps leverage those strengths and overcome those barriers to learning.
So what's the standard? You talk about deficit. I think deficit model. What's this difference between strengths based and that sort of, I don't want to say older style of thinking, but focusing on what kids can't. What's
I think we have to actually go back a bit before that, if that's okay,
yeah,
to talking about the potential barriers to implementing strengths-based inclusion. So we do a lot of work with schools, and the first barrier we see is often we talk about inclusion and we talk about pedagogical strategies and ways of supporting kids, but that's based on an assumption in schools that teachers are accurately using the curriculum, the approved curriculum for that year level. So
yeah.
if we're talking about the Australian curriculum, the assumption is that from prep to 10, it's getting used accurately. And then if a student is struggling, then the teacher needs to change things. But what
Yeah.
happens if the way that the curriculum is being used isn't accurate? And we're adding these things that become barriers to learning for kids, so they can't actually use their strengths to demonstrate their learning.
Okay, so designing the way that you're delivering information in the curriculum in a way that it allows for that to
Can I
happen.
show some examples? Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely. I've got
So
screen sharing.
let me bring this up. Sorry, I'm just uh,
All good.
allowing myself. You know, when technology, you always get nervous, and then
Oh
technology gets.
yeah. I know that feeling well. Every time I finish one of these, and Zoom starts processing and some video
All right,
and
I can share.
processes
Can
things.
you um,
Yeah, yeah, we
see
can see that.
PowerPoint?
Yeah,
So
yeah, I can see that.
yeah, have a look at this. Oh, don't you hate when you know what to do, but you make mistakes?
Yeah, if you just hit allow on Zoom, bypass the private window picker.
So can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah,
So this is an example from English in Australian Curriculum version 9. where this is the achievement standard. So in the Australian curriculum, a teacher teaches the content descriptions, so they teach the knowledge and model the skills.
Yeah.
And then students demonstrate the achievement standards as evidence of learning. And so the green is an achievement standard statement from year 9 English. So they've got 12 months to demonstrate this. What is interesting about an education is Makara, who controls the Australian curriculum, never talks about tests, exams, word limits, any of those things. They
Yeah.
just simply talk about collecting evidence of learning over the 12 months. So theoretically, kids have to the very end of the year to demonstrate their learning. But there are education acts and stuff that talk about 5-point scales, systems work in terms of tests, exams, things like that. And the risk is with the Australian curriculum, if we think about what we learnt at school or what we believe as being important in education, rather than coming back to the curriculum as a source, we have a tendency to add things that might not be there.
Yeah.
And when we do that, we can add barriers to learning that aren't there, that mean our students can't leverage their strengths to demonstrate their learning.
Yeah.
So in this example, green is the curriculum and the red is not. So Akara talks about you shouldn't be adding things to the achievement standards that aren't there. So by adding that you want it in a teal paragraph with topic sentence and so forth, that could be a barrier to learning who can demonstrate analysis of those text structures. And it comes down to knowing how to define the skills in the curriculum, Australian curriculum. Often when I work with teachers, they talk about the curriculum as being content. It's actually a set of skills that are the same from prep to 10 in all learning areas. And
That makes sense, actually.
they're contextualized because they're only defined once in a glossary. And so analysis in maths is the same skill as analysis inside of English, but contextualized to that learning area. But the definition of analyze actually never talks about writing.
No, analyzing. Yeah, it's just I can't remember the exact definition, but yeah,
So let's have a
doesn't
look
say.
at, here's a year 4 example. So imagine I've got a student who, with disability or diverse learning need, who struggles to do handwriting. But in this case, I've said this achievement standard needs to be demonstrated in handwriting to be a C standard because the Australian curriculum only ever talks about at standard. I've now put
Yeah.
up barriers that actually don't exist. The
Yeah.
skills that thrive in the Australian curriculum is defined as to give an account of characteristics or features. It actually doesn't say how it's done. In the Australian curriculum, if Akara wants something written, they actually say that. If they want it spoken, they actually say that. Do you mind if we have a look at a few more examples?
Yeah, definitely. So this is where that universal design comes in, that they can use whatever mechanism to show their understanding. That's not actually defined in the curriculum.
No.
How they show that.
How they show it? No. And
Yeah.
if Akara wants it done in a certain way, they'll actually tell teachers. But if I
Yeah.
don't know the curriculum, I start adding things to it, but
Yeah.
actually might not be there.
Yeah.
And that's
I mean, it's
our barrier.
already complicated enough.
So let me give you an example here. So imagine I'm a year 6 English teacher. And interestingly enough, the Australian curriculum never defines texts in English. It doesn't tell us what books to use. So it might
Yeah.
say text from contemporary First Nations and Australian authors and world authors. So if I know my students and I know what they're interested in, I can choose texts that engage them as long as it fits within what the curriculum is looking for. So let's say I've got a bunch of boys and girls in my class who really love basketball. So in year 6, I might choose one of the Patty Mills books, one of the
Yeah.
NBA, and that engages them. So let's say we read through the first chapter aloud to everyone because it doesn't say that the kids have to read it themselves. And the broad definition of right in the Australian curriculum, there is a big debate at the moment around do kids have to read it themselves or could they have audio books, those sort of things? And then that's the decision between a system versus what Akara says. Can I show you how they're two different things?
Yeah, definitely. Because I'm trying to think. I'm thinking, what are we doing? How are we adding things to?
Let me take you to the Australian Curriculum Glossary for English. I use version 8.4 glossary because they're still
Yeah.
fleshing version 9. So let's go
Yeah.
to English, and I go understand
Ma- I'm
English,
maths and science, so this is good. I mean,
and
it
I click on
probably
English.
applies across the board.
Let's have a look at the definition of read. Oh, this is not English. Sorry, I apologize. I'll take you to the
That's so good.
correct one. So
There we
I'll go
go.
to the English glossary.
So the glossary is kind of if you see something written in the curriculum and you don't know exactly what it means, the glossary will tell you.
Yeah, they actually define everything.
Yeah.
Every term that is used,
I've
they define.
I've never been shown this, just
So
so you know, but I did not know it existed.
look at the definition of read there.
So process word symbols or actions that derive and abstract meaning. Interpreting critically, and it doesn't actually say read it with your eyes on a piece of paper, does it?
It doesn't. But if I think read is only physically read the text,
Mm.
then I'm setting up barriers. What about kids with dyslexia who struggle to read, who could have speech to text or text to
Like
speech?
me,
Sorry. Let me give you
like
an
me.
example of this. So let's say we're reading and I've got a student who struggles to read. A teacher might say, well, a simple adjustment might be putting images of difficult words above the word. Yeah, that might be a simple, reasonable adjustment. But if you're familiar with ABC TV, there's a reporter called Naz Campanella. She's the disability reporter.
Yeah.
So she's blind. So putting pictures with those words not going to help her at all. So you might say, okay, then the reasonable adjustment is using Braille for her, but she's got a medical condition where she can't actually feel her fingertips, so she doesn't have sensation there. So Braille doesn't work. So based
Wow.
on that view, if I take a traditional approach of read, she can't engage with the text at all. So what she
I
does
think,
for her work is she's on TV, she has headphones on, and someone reads the story to her and she repeats it out. So, but if we imagine the curriculum as being something it's not, we cannot harness kids' strengths to demonstrate that learning.
yeah, that's I did not know that. I didn't even I'd never been shown this in any PD in any where that glossary is.
So this is the sort of work that I do with teachers before we even get to universal design as a problem-solving tool. You've got to know you've
Yeah,
got using the curriculum.
yeah. So it's coming home.
That's right. Another example. So let's say we've got a year 6 group of kids. We've got a text on a Patty Mills text, and we have it read aloud to the class, maybe using text to speech, those sort of things, or the teacher reads it aloud to them. As we read through the text, every time we get the students see a text structure, they put their hand up and we highlight it blue and put it into a blue mind map. Then we read through the text again and put their hand up every time they see a language feature and we highlight it green, put it into a green mind map. We look at as a class at those two, then we draw connections between the two. Then we look at the two mind maps again and look for the similarities and differences and do Venn diagrams. That's the skill. That's a skill in the Australian curriculum. That's how students could demonstrate their learning.
Yeah.
Let's have a look
Wow.
at that. Let's have a look at the definition of analyze.
Analyze how text structures.
So that's what they've got to demonstrate, and there's the definition of analyze.
So nothing about writing.
No,
Nothing about how they would show they
no.
can do that
Or a
skill.
skill paragraph. So if I've got a student who struggles to write, they might have a scribe, they might handwrite it, they might type it, they might tell the teacher because it doesn't actually say the word right at all.
Yeah, no, it doesn't at all, does it? That's
We've done a big study with a whole bunch of teachers. So at my workshops, I get to show teachers, because remember, teachers will assume they're using the curriculum accurately from the beginning. So to show them what happens when teachers plan individually, I have a Kahoot quiz. So I ask them, how do they define one of the skills in the Australian curriculum? Then I give them 4 multiple choice answers on Kahoot, all definitions from the Australian curriculum glossaries, and they have to choose the correct one that they would be teaching and assessing. And I've got nearly 2,600 teacher data sets, so a very large sample, and not
yeah.
once does every teacher get it accurate.
Yeah, I think I could take 10 teachers that I work with and they wouldn't know about the glossary and what you've
There's our
just said.
data set.
Explains the big one because that's the verb that everyone in science likes to use.
And did you know explain is the most dominant verb in the Australian curriculum?
Yeah,
So in version 9.4, explain occurs 247 times across all learning areas. Yet,
yeah,
according to our data, 6 out of 10 teachers are not accurately teaching and assessing it. So if I tie it to something that doesn't exist, my students might have these amazing strengths and amazing knowledge, but they can't leverage those strengths to show their learning or even do really well because we've tied the curriculum to something that doesn't exist.
yeah. That's writing. So kids need to be able to write
So can we
to
have a
be
look at
able.
a couple of examples? Let's
Yep.
have a look at the term communicate.
Oh
So
God.
if you said to a group of teachers, when it says communicate in the Australian curriculum, which informs assessment tasks, what would they expect to see? This,
Oh, if you think verbal, I'll have to explain. Verbal or written. I have to convey listening.
doesn't actually say how,
No.
but how often do teachers tie it to writing? What happens if I have a student who could be the next most amazing surgeon or the next Prime Minister of Australia, but they can't use those strengths because we've taken the curriculum to mean something that it doesn't. And then we're constantly putting them down because they can't demonstrate their skills.
So this whole idea starts at the very
Yeah,
base of the curriculum, doesn't it?
coming right
The
back.
idea.
If we
Yeah.
assume that teachers are always accurate.
Yeah. And I think most we sort of get into a pattern and habits and then we just do. We just do and consistently do.
Yeah,
Because
certainly. Can I show you this one? Justify. This is one of the
justify.
highest level skills in the Australian curriculum,
Yeah.
but over half teachers define it as something else and we're teaching something else. In Queensland, it's the bridge between year 10 and years 11 and 12.
Yeah.
Over half our teachers are teaching and assessing something else. Have a look at the definition of justify. It doesn't,
So
once again, it doesn't say how. You have to show how your argument is right or reasonable, but for a student, it could be anything.
yeah, because usually I know math and science, that's my area, but you take a graph, analyze the graph, identify a trend, and then justify the trend.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at maths and science, and that is effectively how it is done across the board.
Yeah,
Science and all the year levels.
it's really interesting because how often, when you think about the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability and diverse learning needs, you've got a teacher who goes, I've got an adjusted assessment, and their adjusted assessment is different to everyone else's. But often those adjusted assessments are what the curriculum actually asks. Because they've
Yeah,
added a whole bunch of things to the curriculum that in their assessment that actually aren't there.
and I've
And then
just
they've
taken it
taken
away.
them away and called that an adjusted assessment. But that's actually what the curriculum is allowed for all students.
Yeah, that makes far too much sense.
I know.
To have never have been told it or to have never had that model by anybody.
When there's a piece of research I read recently from last year that said when educational leaders talk to schools about making changes, they automatically think about putting more things in because they
Yeah,
think
I'll take
it's
it.
better. But actually, better could be taking things away. And in this case, taking things away that actually aren't named.
So why are we at the point where we assume everything has to be written? That the students need
Oh,
to demonstrate through writing. You want to explain
interestingly,
something, it has to be in a teal paragraph. Why are we there?
interestingly enough, two thing comments are always made to me. If I have it in writing, I have evidence.
Yeah.
What is interesting is if I committed a crime and the police said they have evidence against me, they're not going to go, oh, sorry, we're going to let you go because we don't have it in writing. They could
Yeah.
have video, they could have audio, they could photos. Teachers can do that as well. But I think they feel nervous about that because a piece of paper I can pick up, look at it, tick it off, it's done.
yeah, it's consistent. It can be filed away, easily found if need be.
And the other thing they say is, where do I save it? I'm like, every educational system or sector has some sort of database that you could save those things onto.
Yeah, well, but one EQ has OneDrive, so I
Yeah, which
imagine I think the others use Google.
the other thing they talk about is, how do I ensure consistency or fairness? I think when you tie everything to writing, people think the writing is what is important. But when we look at the Australian Curriculum Achievement Standards, there's a whole lot of things that kids need to demonstrate, say, to be a C standard. It doesn't say write, it might say compare living and non-living things. So if compare is find similarities and differences between living and non-living things. If they've done that, whether they've done it in writing or verbally, it doesn't matter. Have they compared or found the similarities and differences between the two? Yes, they have. So
My brain instantly goes to that communication in science. We have the communication section. Immediately I
yeah,
start thinking, well, how can they need to write scientifically, but then it's not that they're writing scientifically. They could speak scientifically as well. Which
yeah, that's the
that just
interesting thing is,
yeah.
and often we think about the extreme cases. So, I know there's a gentleman who's a medical doctor in the Gold Coast who's a quadriplegic. So, he can do science, but in school, we bring everything back to a certain way of demonstrating it, forgetting that there's all this flexibility and this diversity within our communities.
And yeah,
Can I show you a couple more interesting ones? Have
yeah,
a look at
definitely. I'm
one.
kind of blown away a little bit of my own ignorance here.
Have a look at this cognitive verb of discuss. So more teachers knew it than didn't. About 65% of teachers knew it out of the multiple choice. Here's the definition of discuss. Akara actually says kids can talk it out and be a C standard if it says the word discuss. They explicitly tell teachers that. But
Yeah,
what happens if I don't know the curriculum? What happens if I have a kid who can't write, who can talk it out and be amazing, but I've said it's got to be in writing only because I actually don't know the definition.
yeah.
And notice,
And most kids can talk better than they can write. It's
yeah,
less of a cognitive load
yeah,
to talk
certainly.
something through.
Look
Almost.
at this and taking into account different issues or ideas. So in the content descriptions that I teach, if I don't know discussers take into account different issues or ideas, I might model this skill of discussers talking about one thing. I've now set my kids up for failure.
Yeah,
Have a look at that word. It also says kids can write. Have a think
yeah.
about if the word write comes up in an assessment, what would teachers mainly think about?
Paragraph
Paragraphing,
structure.
writing, those sort of things. Can we go back to the glossary again? Show you something else? Let's have a look at the definition of write.
Digital forms, which again, if you're using talk to text, yeah, speech to text, that's technical writing.
So there was a video that came out from the Queensland Department of Education 2 years ago on the inclusive definition of right. So in the video, it says, if the word right comes in the achievement standards, students can have a scribe, handwrite, use Braille, use eye gaze technology, put photos or pictures together. So if you've got a student with an intellectual disability and they've got to create a text, they could put photos or pictures together and be a C standard.
I mean,
Type,
but how would that work with the communication part? If we had if we
so
scientific
type.
inquiry skills, if we
Yep.
had that communication.
Let me show you an example in a sec. I've got plenty of these. So
Perfect.
type or speech to text. So
Yeah,
they're all the definition of right. So any student can do any of those.
yeah,
So if I think about the nationally consistent collection of data, which teachers often say is really hard because you've got to collect lots of evidence, if I only let my kids handwrite, I will never have any evidence for NCCD. There is no diagnostic disability that has handwriting as a support.
yeah,
But if I take the broad definition, I let my kids type, or use speech to text, I automatically have evidence of quality differentiated teaching practice. If I let students have a scribe, I've automatically got evidence of supplementary, and the others are above that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if I don't know the definition, I start to add a whole lot of things that might not be there. So I'll jump through, we'll come back to this in a sec. Can I show you an example of where we could use the image as a right? Remember, we're going from all the way through to year 10 with the Australian curriculum. So let's have a look at this. This is a year 1 example. This is an achievement standard that students need to demonstrate.
Create short, written, and multimodal teachers when it comes to those things.
And in the Australian curriculum, multimodal is defined as 2 or more forms of communication. Could be writing with something else, but it doesn't have to be. Often, the biggest debate here is what is a recount? In prep, in Queensland, like we call it prep, in foundation, they use the word retell. And so for me, I've got a 11-year-old son. I think back to when he was really little, and you ask your child about something, and a retell becomes telling you a 30-minute story about a small little thing, whereas a recount is more of a summary. So if we're taking that idea of broad definition of right, couldn't a teacher do this? As a class, we watch Bluey Cricket because Bluey Cricket is the best episode of Bluey. Then I read aloud the story to the class talking about it. Then we watch Bluey Cricket again, and we read Bluey Cricket again because we get lots of context. Then I put the scaffold of the beginning, middle, and end of the story up on the whiteboard, because when you go into the content descriptions and elaborations for that year level, it talks about beginning, middle, and end. Then I put around the classroom a whole lot of Bluey pictures and photos. Okay, class, I want you to go and find a picture that represents the beginning of the Bluey story and put it in the scaffold. I want you to go and find a picture of Bluey that represents the middle of the story and put it in our scaffold, and one that represents the end and put it in our scaffold. That actually hits the definition of right in the Australian curriculum. So kids right at the moment can do that. Some might handwrite underneath more, or type it, or have speech to text, or have it scribe.
It's a great way to, if everybody did this, to say explain a scientific concept, it's a great way for even kids that can write, they start it, and then they add to it, and they increase. They can then push higher and higher, but they're all starting from the same point.
Certainly. Can I show you this one? This is an interesting one. I've taught HPE a few times because I've spent 25 years in the classroom. Let's have a look at refine. So nearly 50%, a bit over 50% could accurately define that. And this is where it gets interesting. Here's the definition of refine.
Improve applying knowledge on skills.
What happens if teachers don't talk at the planning table? One teacher might think refine means a small change. Another might expect it to be a big PhD of changes. But the definition is subtle or fine distinction. So if it's had refine in language features in English, it might be moving the noun, verb, and object around. What is interesting in the HPE curriculum from foundation to year 10, the word right never comes up.
Yeah, I've taught HPE and I'm never saying right.
But how often
up to grade 10.
HPE teachers teaching kids how to write essays, and then kids spend a month working on an essay writing when it's actually not required?
Why do we do that? What are the reasons? Is it
my experience in Queensland would be, but in year 11 and 12 we need to do these things.
Okay. Yeah.
So yes, we do in 11 and 12, but QCAA would say to prepare kids for the year 11 and 12, you teach and assess the Australian curriculum accurately, but we're not.
Yeah.
What happens if the reason our kids aren't ready for 11 and 12 is because we're not actually doing that? In this case, in year 7 and 8, there's an achievement standard that says students select, use, and refine strategies for inclusive play. So select is choose in preference of another, use is put in place, and refine is make subtle changes or distinctions.
Yeah.
So why couldn't I, as a HPE teacher, I take my class into the hall, sit them down, say, we're going to look at basketball for today. I'm going to put a whole lot of basketball strategies up on the wall. We're going to select one together. There's the select element. So I'm videoing this lesson as evidence of learning. So we've selected it. Now let's go do it. And we play that skill for a while. Then we come back and sit down. Okay, guys, what happens if we had a student with a wheelchair in our class? Would that be an inclusive strategy? Yes or no? No, why not? How could we refine or make subtle changes to that strategy to make it more inclusive for a child in a wheelchair? Okay, now let's go and give it a go. There's evidence of learning that did not require putting a pen to paper.
No. Yeah, yeah, that makes far too much sense.
I know it does, doesn't it? Like, just quickly jump to writing all the time.
Yeah,
Have
and
a
I look at my reluctant writers, yeah, ODD kids, OCD kids that will not only write under certain circumstances. That when you
yeah,
take the writing away, all of a sudden their abilities just go through the
I
roof.
know. And I always say to teachers, what is the purpose of education? Is it to prove what kids can do, or is it to prove what they can't?
Yeah,
If it's to prove what they can do, use the curriculum correctly. If it's to prove what they can't, add a whole bunch of things there that don't need to be there or aren't developmentally appropriate, and then block them to demonstrating what they're learning. But if it's to show what they can do, use the curriculum accurately.
yeah, yeah. We seem to have added a whole barriers to the kids, but also just extra stuff that we need to do.
Yeah. Akara says
That
if a
is,
student is at school and tries and the teacher teaches the curriculum correctly, every student can hit a C standard.
yeah. So
That how
I've not met many kids that, I mean, if they have an intellectual disability, they'll be on ICP, so they could hit at their year level,
yeah.
but that couldn't, in their own way, demonstrate knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, because it's important about the curriculum. Let's have a look at explain. This is the one that
Yeah,
teachers knew to leave, but in version 9 of the curriculum occurs 247 times.
it's the classic what, why, how.
So let's
Explain
have
it.
a look at the definition of explain.
Demonstrates understanding.
So I've spent 25 years in secondary school classrooms. And unfortunately, teaching now has been doing worksheets, textbooks, copying notes off a PowerPoint or a board, and then writing those notes into a test. That's not explain. If I take notes that a teacher's taught me and write them into a test, that's actually regurgitation, and that's not explain.
It's having a state-based sort of, so you talk about QCAA and VCAA and paint all the other, because
Yeah, cool.
they make alterations to these verbs. I know
Yeah.
QCAA definition of explain is different to the
Yeah, that's the
VCAA
year
definition
11
of
and
explain.
12 definitions. So
Yeah,
that PDF document is the year 11 and 12 glossary definitions because they're different to Peter 10. Unfortunately, I've seen prep teachers using the year 11 and 12 definitions
yeah,
and expecting a lot more. An example of this, if it says students explain their preferences for characters in year one, and a student likes the very cranky bear, the teacher doesn't want to hear, I like the very cranky bear because they're big, brown, have sharp teeth, and angry.
yeah,
That's description. They want to hear, I really like the very cranky bear. He reminds me of my granddad. My granddad sleeps all the time.
yeah.
But when I wake him up, he
But
gets really angry and chases me around the house. But I like it because when he catches me, he tickles me. So that additional information demonstrates to the teacher that they understand that character. But if
yeah,
I either make it description or make it in writing, I actually then take away students' abilities to do that. And they can't leverage their strengths or what they know or what they can demonstrate verbally or some other way because we've tied it to things that might not exist.
made it harder, easier for administrators to collect information and collect assessments, but harder on students and ourselves.
And schools are so focused on A to C grades,
Yeah,
their percentage of A, C grades. But what happens if those percentages of A to C grades are low because our C includes a whole lot of things that don't actually need to be there?
yeah.
Imagine
We
how
can,
successful our kids could be if see, that's where it gets challenging. The Australian curriculum only ever says a C and never talks
yeah,
about what B and A looks like. That can be whatever a school wants it to be. But if in the C, you've tied it to a whole bunch of things, but I've got a student with a whole lot of strengths over here. Let's say I've got a student who's twice exceptional, student on the spectrum who's also gifted in an
yeah,
area, and they struggle with receptive and expressive language. They struggle to express what they can do in writing. They struggle to understand things. But I put make my achievement standard skills tied to writing when they're not actually there. They could have been an A if I used the curriculum properly, but I've actually put writing in here, which is a barrier to learning for them. And now they're getting a D or an E, not because they know it and can demonstrate it. It's because of the decisions I made at the planning table.
Yeah, we're seemingly adding barriers to learning and then taking them away. Yeah.
Yeah. And
That
that's the work I do with teachers. So I don't
yeah.
do workshops anymore. I run some, but most of my time is sitting at the planning table with teachers. So when I do, I ask them never to bring units, never to bring assessment tasks with them, because when they look at them, their thought process is automatically influenced by them. We'll go to the curriculum as its source, put the achievement standards on a Word document, focus on the ones we're going to assess, define the cognitive verbs, work out what is being assessed, create our own assessment task from scratch. Then we bring out their old one. So you've got one page here, and this looks like this. Over here, you've got 15 pages, and it looks like that. Why do they look so different?
Yeah. Far too much sense. So
Then coming down to strengths, the other thing we do with teachers is the next barrier is not knowing your students' strengths and functional impacts. Have you ever
yeah.
worked with a teacher who thinks about kids as labels? You know,
Labels, yeah.
that child has dyslexia. If I was a child in a secondary school nowadays, I would be the highest needs rated, probably the highest needs child in Queensland. If you had a head of special education who worked in an old medical model where a
Yeah.
diagnosis equated to not doing much. I'm a man on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
I have PTSD. I have a hearing impairment, so I wear hearing aids, but I don't at the moment because the batteries are not charged. So
Yeah.
I can't used to do that. I have something called hypertonia, which is embarrassingly
Yeah.
called floppy baby syndrome. So my shoulders pop out, I fall over all the time,
Yeah.
kind of embarrassing. And from 18 to 28, I had anorexia nervosa. So I had an eating disorder. So if you had a head of special education who works in a medical model where that diagnosis meant you couldn't do anything, I should be seen to be not being able to be very successful. But that's not
Yeah.
how that. I just need that good teaching. So let's imagine a teacher in a school who does think about kids as labels. What do? They probably go to a website or a textbook about that disability. They look for a list of strategies and they randomly choose a strategy from that list. But that the odds of that strategy working are like winning the lotto. How often a strategy disability is very broad, but the strategy
That's why
is
it's
very
called a
narrow.
spectrum.
Yeah. And so it doesn't work. So the teacher gets really frustrated. It should work. It's in a book. It's on a website. But if it doesn't, then they go and get frustrated, and then they probably do it again and again. And
Yeah.
then teachers end up doing a lot more work than they need to because they've put this strategy in place that hasn't worked. Then they go and choose another strategy. It doesn't work. Then they choose another strategy. So moving away from that idea of labels, we work with schools around strengths and barriers to learning, but not for
Yeah.
individual kids. UDL is about a whole class, thinking about the whole class. So this is the nationally consistent collection of data evidence templates. This is their individual learning plan. So the federal government says this is student identifiers. They want to know who they are, and then who are at meetings and signatures. They're very pedantic about signatures and dates in terms of
Yeah.
audits.
I did a lot of these indie and miss a signature somewhere, and all of a sudden, the world's ended.
Notice there is no diagnosis. They're not interested in diagnosis. That's the least important
No.
thing. They
Yeah.
ask the first thing they ask is what are students' strengths? So if I go into school to provide support and a teacher's written down nice and kind, I know straight away that that teacher doesn't know that student's strengths because that's just an assumption about kids.
Yeah.
Strengths need to be things that we can leverage to access the learning process. But nice and kind doesn't help us at all. Then the federal government talks about what are their kids' barriers to that learning process.
Yeah.
Federal government advocates teachers know their kids' strengths. But could you imagine how great it would be if every teacher could name those strengths of those kids in their class?
Yeah, I think the vast majority of us would be able to tell you what the kids struggle with,
Yeah.
but not what
Because,
they're really good at.
yeah. Okay, tell me about Johnny. okay, Johnny can't do this, Johnny can't do this, Johnny can't do this. Okay, let's park
Yeah.
that. What's Johnny really good at? And it might be
Yeah.
cricket. So I use these two frameworks with teachers when I help plan and problem solve. I use problem solve because not it's a problem, but just as a process of working out what we can do to support kids. So
Yeah.
when we think about tier one universal design, what are the group characteristics of our students? What are the strengths of all the kids in our class? Because at that tier one, we want pedagogical strategies that support everyone.
Yeah.
Then what are the
No.
barriers to learning for everyone in that class? Then what are the strategies that we can do and use to support kids, all kids in that class to access the learning process? Then when we think about individuals, because there will be students who still need more, we do the same thing, individual characteristics, student strengths, barriers to learning, but it's always strengths first. Then when see, we've already used these strategies, so we don't now have to do those a second time. We're not doing everything a second time. We already have a really solid base. Now we think about what are we doing different. So we're not doing more work. We're just doing really good first teaching and then the little bit more that other kids need.
Not try to differentiate to 20 different kids or 25 different kids, 25
Let's
different
come,
ways at the same time.
let's come back to that definition of right, that broad definition of right. So if I only let all kids in my class handwrite, I'm going to be putting out fires everywhere. But let's say I follow that broad definition. Some kids can handwrite, some kids can type, some can use speech to text. Nearly everyone's captured. I've got a student over
Yeah.
here who's an individual curriculum plan. They put pictures and photos together, but that's who is doing different. And I can give him or her quality focus and quality support while everyone else is
Yeah.
catered for.
Yeah. See, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And that's what universal design about is what is good for everyone.
Yeah.
So when we think about a whole class, I often model this out for teachers, and it might surprise you, but every teacher thinks their class is different, but they always come up with similar. They
Yeah.
always say something to do with literacy and something to do with engagement. We don't use low
Yeah.
literacy on disengagement because they're automatically negative and we can't think about their strengths. So varying
Yeah.
levels of literacy and varying levels of engagement allow that. Then we look at what are the students' strengths in their class. This is done by a teacher, but I just use it as a model. And we would do this together. And the more you do it, teachers can just do it internally and they don't need to map it out.
Yeah, I think teachers struggle when they look at universal design for learning because it looks really complicated and hard to figure out. But it seemingly would make far less work.
Yes, certainly. And then we look at what are their barriers to learning. So can I show you some tricks to do with the universal design for learning framework?
Yeah, that would be great because I know I try to implement it, but often revert back to that old model. Um, and I know a lot of people do the same thing and think, big scary framework, it's hard,
Oh,
it's lots of planning and work. And
certainly. This is the broad definition of universal design for learning in the nationally consistent collection of data glossary from the federal government. But my experience is teachers need really practical, detailed
yeah,
examples because
yeah,
according to this, throw the subtitles on, everyone is good. But it's not actually how that works. And this
no,
is that connection to the nationally consistent collection. Those supports that are good for all diverse learners. Not I do write the page numbers of the textbook on the board and kids struggle and then I make heaps of changes. What is good for everyone? So you said when you look at the UDL
yeah.
framework, it looks quite big. This
It
is the
looks good.
old version. I actually say to people, it looks like a menu because it is. So if I
Yeah,
went to a restaurant and I felt like an Italian dish, I'd choose an Italian meal. I wouldn't choose everything in the menu. So if I'm sitting with teachers and I'm planning with them and said, talk me through what are some of your kids' barriers to the learning process? And they told me, well, I've got students who can do it today but can't do it tomorrow. We'd come up to the framework here and look at it and look at these dot points. They give us ideas of how to overcome those barriers. They're not strategies, but I might pick one or two of those and then I think about those and then I choose strategies within those ideas. So there is no teacher who could do all of it ever.
yeah. And I think that's where people get stuck. They have to think they have to do all of everything
But
in there.
remember, to do better, people add more, but sometimes you
Yeah,
can do that.
that's the classic idea. If I want to do better, I need to be doing more.
Yeah. So as we go through this, like each one of these rectangular boxes are more specific ways of doing it, and the dot points are very targeted. So the first principle, the green one, is around engagement. To engage kids, the first thing we need to do is recruit their interest. So you could connect the curriculum to what they're interested in, connect it as a reward system, like leverage those strengths. Minecraft, if you've got a student with an amazing knowledge of Minecraft, that could be a way to connect to the curriculum or a reward system. But another way, so when we talk about recruiting kids' interest, have you ever had kids who are so scared of being wrong they don't give it a go?
Yeah.
So the
All the time.
framework also talks about minimizing threats and distractions. That's not a strategy, it's a way of thinking about teaching, and then I choose a strategy that fits within that. So what I could do is structured task analysis. And this is actually a strategy named in the nationally consistent collection of data at the supplementary level. It's the only time ever that the federal government names a teaching strategy. So this is the definition of structured task analysis. Being a maths or science teacher, they often fit with that. It's where you've got a defined learning goal and you break it down into tiny little steps. You can't do it for writing a paragraph.
A ladder.
Yeah. And there's significant research out there on its effectiveness, especially for kids, say, with an intellectual disability. The world's leading expert is Bree Jimenez in the US. And there's this. Let's have a look at an example of where I could do a structured task analysis and connect it to Lego. If I've got a student who's got an interest in Lego, I can connect it to that. So let's have a look at this. So if I was adding that, and I could go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and I'm actually breaking it down into tiny little steps, and I concretely do that in front of my class. And as I do it and talk it out, I'm actually videoing the process, breaking it down into tiny little steps. So then once I've finished modeling with my kids, I send that video to all my kids' laptops or iPads. If they can't remember how to do it, they watch a bit, pause it, do the step. Watch a bit, pause it, do the step. So I'm actually thinking about what are those potential barriers that exist and how can I leverage those and overcome those to support kids to access that.
Because I know in maths, especially kids struggle to look at the board and then look back down and write, and then they look back up and they get lost and then they hands down.
Yeah. Think about ourselves. If you're not sure how to do something, you watch a YouTube video and then do it.
Yeah.
Then to engage kids, we sustain their effort and persistence. We support them and we focus on self-regulation, supporting kids with self-regulation, and it talks about things like zones of regulation, so forth. Now, when we get into representing the content description, so teaching them knowledge and modeling the skills, we need to make sure kids can physically access that information. So maybe it's turning math, using concrete materials in maths. Maybe it's in English, there's a movie and a book, it's called Holes from Disney. So some kids might read the hard copy of the book. Some might have the book read to them. Some might read the book on an iPad. Some might have the iPad read it to them. Some might watch the movie because it's exactly the same as the book. And I put the subtitles on. There's 6 ways to access that text. So hand on heart, all kids in my class can physically access that text. Because if I can't access it, I can't do anything with it.
Yeah. And the curriculum, when it says read, doesn't say it has to be read off a page of a book.
Yep. And then the next part of the model is that we clarify language and symbols. If kids can access the text, but they actually don't know what it's about and they don't understand the terminology, it becomes a big issue. So I read an article recently, they said if kids don't know about 70% of the terminology used in a text, they will never be able to comprehend it. So imagine I'm year 7 geography, and I'm going to think about how I can get my kids to understand the terminology of deforestation. So this is the framework that suggests ways to do that, but they're not strategies. So what I might do is functional grammar, which comes from speech pathologists. Then I look up terminology not known and look it up on Google Images and then create Freya models. So I might read this text aloud to my class once, then read it aloud again, this time highlighting the nouns, verbs, and objects, red, green, and blue, so kids can see where they fit. So that's 2 reads. Then we read it aloud a 3rd time, this time highlighting the key terminology. Then we read a 4th time, this term, focusing on the term deforestation. Okay, class, I don't know what deforestation means. Does anyone know what deforestation means? How could we find out what it means? Let's put it into Google Images and let's have a look at the images. What do you see there? What do you think it means? And then we create Freya models of definitions, examples, and non-examples, using those as using visuals instead of written examples and non-examples, because Visuals cut through the message often for kids. And then I put that on my classroom wall, send it to my kids' OneNote. But how often especially in secondary school and higher primary, we rush through things.
Yeah. That's
But
so much. We've added so much now that there's so much to get done.
we need to spend that quality time. Then the last part is supporting comprehension. So if you were going to say to a group of teachers in your school, how do you define comprehension? What do you think they would say?
How they kids understand something that's been
What,
said or comprehend an idea,
what
what they
happens if
think it
that's not the
means.
definition of comprehension in the Australian curriculum?
Definitely.
This is foundational prep to year 10.
Yeah.
What is the text about?
Activating prior knowledge, identifying information.
Interesting, isn't it? So if that's the definition of comprehension, that's what we're teaching, but we're not teaching it, our kids can't do comprehension. And what happens when they get to 11 and 12 and they have to demonstrate comprehension, but we haven't been teaching and assessing it?
I won't be able to do it.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing. But teachers need to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go to the Australian curriculum and look at it and focus on not what I think it needs to be. I've had teachers at workshops go, Matt, that's wrong. That's not the dictionary definition. No, it's not. That's the current Australian curriculum definition.
The definition that matters.
I would want to go to a doctor who knows my body parts. I want to go to a teacher who knows the curriculum really well.
Yeah, 100%.
Then when we get to the kids demonstrating the learning, it talks about kids need to be allowed to physically demonstrate what they can do. We saw that putting pictures together around Bluey or physically demonstrating. Think about yourself. Are you better at doing something or writing about it? So it's allowing kids to do that. I read a middle school literacy journal a few years ago where a teacher put a big box of Lego in the middle of the room and said, I want you to get Lego and build the scene of your story. And then once you built it, turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor about the story before they write it up. So they've given options to physically demonstrate it. And we saw this example from Bluey.
Yeah.
Then we taught kids to express and communicate, and we use those definitions accurately. We follow what the definition says. So they could, if it's right, it's got those broad definitions of right. For example, in handwriting is only named in prep to year 4 English in one achievement standard statement. It actually stops after year 4. So the Queensland Department of Education in that video on the broad definition of right actually says, outside of year 4 English, students don't have to demonstrate handwriting or demonstrate their learning through handwriting. So in any other learning area, there is no requirement to handwrite anything.
Yeah, then, you're right.
What else do I do?
But we get everyone to write things down in an exam.
Yeah,
60
certainly.
minutes.
This is an interesting study I like to show teachers. Coming back to what is the purpose of education? Is it for kids to prove what they can do or show what they can't?
Generally choose language text, yeah. Well, it takes away the cognitive thinking of having to type, having to write. Especially kids with dyslexia, it's going to put a huge amount of effort into writing in a way that someone can understand so they don't get in trouble or shamed or pass.
And think about handwriting. Your brain runs faster than your hand can write.
Especially true with your ADHD kids.
Yeah. Everyone, they can put it down. The last part of it is supporting executive functioning. Each one of these is a hierarchy. If your kids struggle with executive functioning, you come back and go, can they express and communicate their ideas? Can they physically demonstrate it? It goes each way. Have you ever worked with a student who can demonstrate one thing today but can't do it tomorrow? Often teachers, that's a sign of a disability. But did you know that's normal for all humans? It's called the forgetting curve. So according to psychological research, after a day, most people have forgotten 40% of what they were taught. Doesn't make us dumb, doesn't mean a disability. It actually means that we're human.
Yeah.
After a week, the research says that most people forget about 70% of what they were taught. Yet in our traditional school, we teach, 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 then assess 8 weeks later. No wonder our kids struggle, something that was demonstrated very early on. To overcome this, you need to give them ways to keep on coming back to it. So if I
Yeah.
model my maths using concrete materials, film it and send it to my class, they can watch that video over and over again, and it helps overcome that forgetting curve.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why with the UDL, a lot of times weekly small tasks that they're assessed on there.
Yes, certainly.
The
Have you
other way
ever
to do that.
have you done the learning walks and talks before? From Sharon and Fulham?
In what
Feedback,
context? Yes. Yeah. The 5 questions we
training,
do
how are
that
you
with.
going? How do you know? When
Yeah.
I do these with teachers, it tells me if there's executive functioning support for a student. So let's
Yeah.
think about a response. What do you learn in math? How are you going? Good. How do you know I've finished all my work? Doesn't know if it's right or not. How could
Yeah.
you improve? Try harder. Where can you go help? Teacher, I've heard policeman, nurse, doctor, so many different things. But imagine I'm teaching and scaffolding history in year 10, and I use a scaffold like this color coded so students can see where things go, and I model it, and they have a success checklist to checklist what they can do. So we're leveraging their strengths rather than focusing on what they can't do. Imagine their responses now to the
Yeah.
learning book will be much more detailed. When we
Yeah.
talk about gifted students, have you ever heard teachers say, "Oh, but yeah, scaffolding dumbs down for kids"?
No, I think it
Comment that
takes
I've
that
heard sometimes.
take. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then I asked, what do you mean by scaffolding? And one teacher said to me, starts pointing at imaginary student going, do this, do that. I said, that's spoon feeding. That's not scaffolding.
No.
Here's an example that I would expect to see, say, in year 10, evaluate. So students evaluate strategies to address a geographical phenomenon, and we define evaluate. It doesn't say how. So we allowing kids to leverage their strengths. And there's a scaffold where they can put that in there in any different way.
Yeah.
But it's how teachers define scaffolding and what they know about the curriculum so they can do it. The other thing that we find hard for teachers is this is where kids struggle to show their strengths. Is have you ever worked with a teacher when you've suggested something to them and they go, yeah, tried that, did that, didn't work?
Yeah.
Do they actually do it or do they believe they did it? So a teacher might spend all weekend planning these most inclusive strategies, but what happens if when the rubber hits the road, rather than doing those, they just talk at kids the whole time?
Yeah. And then we get behavior problems and frustration and the actual implementation. Yeah. What's implementable?
This is an interesting study from the US where they interviewed over 5,000 teachers and said, tell us about your inclusive practices that you used. Then they went and observed the classroom, and the teachers, 87% of the time, the teachers were not doing what they said they were doing.
Yeah.
And then if I have these strategies to allow my kids to leverage their strengths, but I'm not putting those in place, then I'm actually setting up barriers, which means my kids are going to struggle and not being able to access that.
Yeah. Well, you have flipped my mind on its head with this. Now I have to go back and reevaluate everything I've been doing.
No, it's
Thinking,
just things to consider. But thank you, Liam, for your
yeah,
opportunity. Is there any questions
no,
you can answer?
I might sit. I might even see if you want to do a part two where I can do some questions now that once I've sort of sat and pondered over it in my head.
Yes,
I,
certainly.
I'm,
I'm
I'm
always
a,
happy.
I'm a take in information, ponder, then ask questions kind of person. But you're right. I mean, it's hard to argue with pretty much everything you said. That we've added a lot of barriers, and that we spent so much time taking them away
And certainly,
through. Yeah,
and I know teachers are, it's hard to change. I'm a man on the spectrum. I find it hard to change. But
yeah,
our results in Australia on education are declining constantly. They're
yeah.
going down. Look at that
What
recent
do?
study on 1 out of 4 kids in year 10 don't know civics and citizenship. Yet we keep
Yeah,
on doing what we're doing and our results are getting worse. Maybe it's time to reconsider how we do things.
yeah, yeah. I would love to do like part two Q&A with you because I know that those people watch that will also have the same questions.
Well, thank you.
We,
I'll,
I
I'll
really, I
come
really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. It was good to finally touch base and we got some soul searching to do now.
Thanks, Liam. Nice to meet you.
No worries. Have a fantastic day. Thank you so much.
That's all right. See you later.
See ya.
Bye.